So I've been playing fantasy football for over a decade at this point. And over that time, over that decade, I have won dozens and dozens of fantasy football championships, guys. And what we need to realize about football and fantasy football is that fantasy football relies on a sport that is extremely physical. So that means you're going to see a lot of injuries to this sport compared to what you'll see in basketball or baseball or other sports like that. This is a very injury-prone sport, and a lot of top athletes are getting injured at this time of the year right now. So I'm going to walk you guys through some of my best and favorite tricks to win your fantasy football playoffs in 2023. And I am doing everything I can to help you guys win your fantasy football playoffs in 2023. So please go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So the first tip I have on here, really, I think this is the most important tip I could give you. Number one tip is to go with your gut. Here's the thing about fantasy football. I just gave myself this intro. I've been playing fantasy for over a decade, and that is 100% true. I have also won dozens and dozens of fantasy championships over that time as well, including some higher stakes leagues where I've gotten some pretty good payouts. But here's the reality, guys. I get things wrong. I get things wrong every single week. I have an entire segment dedicated to what I got right and what I got wrong every single week during the fantasy football season, guys. I am not perfect, and I am not always going to get it right. And you can see that across the board, regardless of any fantasy channel that you go on YouTube. And that's not to call out other channels. That is to say that you watching have just as good of a shot sometimes to make the best calls for your particular team. For example, I will give you an example of just this week. I am filming this after the New England Patriots played the Pittsburgh Steelers on Thursday night. I told a lot of people in my audience to bench Zeke Elliott. He had a good game. He had a very good game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and that was one that, based on efficiency numbers, based on every metric that really matters in fantasy football, based on what I have seen from him, I said this is not a good opportunity. It turned out to be a very good opportunity, and there was a lot of people in my audience who were not very happy with me about that one right now. So this is just coming from a point of transparency, because I always find it very important to be transparent with everybody watching that your instincts sometimes you need to follow. And I want you guys to win your fantasy championships. So in the playoffs, if you strongly disagree with me or whoever you follow, whoever you primarily watch on YouTube, go with your gut. Go with your gut always, guys. This is a sport that is unpredictable, and we do our best, and we are uniquely positioned sometimes to give very good calls, but I don't always get it right on this channel, and I will be the first one to admit that on a weekly basis. So I want everybody watching to make sure you know you can go with your gut at all times in the playoffs. The next tip I have on here, I think this one is very easy to forget. The next tip I have in here is called ride the wave. Now, what I mean by saying ride the wave is when I say we can give examples over the past several years. Let's give a couple over recent years. So in 2022, Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers, wide receiver, he was a rookie that year. Now, at the beginning of 2022, really through the first 3 quarters of the fantasy season, he was irrelevant. He was a nothing burger for everybody that rostered him, and he likely was not rostered by about mid-season of last season. Well, then when you get to playoff time, you could see his numbers on the screen. He became a key piece down a very key stretch for many fantasy football playoff teams in specific here. Now let's look at Cam Akers. Cam Akers in 2022 with the Los Angeles Rams was largely irrelevant for those who drafted him in like the 4th or 5th round last year. He was dropped on a lot of waiver wires that year. But during the fantasy football playoffs, he was outstanding. Outstanding. He was absolutely excellent in the fantasy football playoffs. Now, it's very hard to get past what you've seen from a player at the beginning half of the season, which is why I always stress that it is important to look at fantasy football in terms of 4 quarters in a season. That first quarter, you're going to have someone like a Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots going off, being close to the tight end 1, and then by quarter 4, he's not really relevant again. Now, he also had a decent game against the Steelers on Thursday night in Week 14. But for the most part, there's a lot more examples than that. So the point in this segment is to say, if you've got somebody that you know you can acquire, who's sitting there going off, pick that player up, because while it may just be a fluke, you may need to ride the wave of somebody who can get you 25-point games in the fantasy playoffs, because every point matters. And the more you can put yourself ahead with upside plays, that's when you're going to start seeing fantasy football championships rolling in, and maybe your bank account even rolling in as well, because some of you may be playing in paid leagues where you can get a good payout if you win your championship. And that leads me into the next tip right here. Play the waiver wire. Play the waiver wire even this late. Fantasy football, you can play the waiver wire year round. Now, that is not to suggest that you should be playing the waiver wire and playing those players off the waiver wire for the majority of your season. If that happens, something went really, really wrong with your team. There's no getting around that. If you are playing the waiver wire and everybody in your roster is a waiver wire player, something went very wrong. And there's chances are you are not in the playoffs. Now, with the defense and kicker position in specific, I have put out videos over the last several weeks telling you guys who my favorite defenses and kickers are for the fantasy football playoffs. Now, that takes into account multiple different things. How they have done so far, how they're looking right now on a visual perspective when you watch them play. Also, where their numbers are going. Also, where the matchups are. Now, I have a secret for you. Not all of those defenses, if you have not watched the playoff defense ranking video, not all of them have every great matchup every single week. Teams are playing the Panthers week 17, playing the New England Patriots week 15, the New York Jets in week 14. Not every defense has a great matchup every week, and so for the defense and the kicker positions specifically, I advise you playing the waiver wire still, because again, riding the wave with a defense, a kicker, or any position on the waiver wire is going to be a smart move if you've got injuries at this time of the season. And by the way, most teams have at least one injured player by now in your fantasy football playoff stretch. So don't think you're alone in that one, because you're not. The next tip I have for you, matchup matters. Matchup is a big thing in fantasy football. Now, this comes with specific positions. Specific positions, you just have to play your guys. You've got guys like Christian McCaffrey and Justin Jefferson and AJ Brown and CeeDee Lamb, right? You don't sit those guys in your fantasy football playoffs. But if you were talking about some fringe guys, someone in the range of T. Higgins or Zay Flowers, maybe somebody in the range of Keaton Mitchell right now at the running back position. If you're talking about those types of guys, those are the types of guys that matchup needs to be taken into account here, because matchups will affect one way or the other whether you're going to be in good position or not. So if we're discussing the running back position right now, and you're looking at a team like the San Francisco 49ers right now, the San Francisco 49ers are one of the worst teams that you can have your running back go up against. So unless you do have a top tier option like a Travis Etienne, a Josh Jacobs, who you are going to start either way, if you've got a fringe running back, Jaylen Warren, Keaton Mitchell, those types of guys, Brian Robinson even, if they're playing the 49ers, you might be better off with an option who may be less than ordinarily, but are playing against the Carolina Panthers. Matchup matters 100% in your fantasy football playoffs, and really all season, but it becomes amplified as everything else does in the fantasy football playoffs. And the last tip that I have for you guys really coincides with this as well. While matchup does matter for a lot of players, either way, you have to play your stars in the fantasy football playoffs. You cannot sit Christian McCaffrey. You cannot sit Justin Jefferson. You cannot sit CeeDee Lamb. You can't sit these types of guys. Tyreek Hill should not be on your bench any particular week. If you have any of those types of stars that you have been depending on for the season, the entire season, just because they have a bad matchup does not mean that you need to sit them. And this may come as an obvious point to you, right? I think it is relatively obvious to a lot of us, but I will say that About a month ago, I remember people looking ahead to the fantasy football playoff schedule and asking me if they should trade Tyreek Hill because of his tough playoff schedule. You can see that playoff schedule on the screen right now, and it is not exactly an easy one. But here's the other thing. You can also see the numbers on the screen. What Tyreek Hill is doing right now. You do not bench Tyreek Hill. And if your trade deadline is not passed, if somebody is looking to send Tyreek Hill in fear of that, you buy them right now. Because the reality is you need as many stars as you could possibly get on your fantasy football playoff team. Now, some years it may not work out. Some years are not for you. Because while I have mentioned I have won dozens of fantasy championships, I have also lost a lot of fantasy championships over that time as well. And you live and you learn. Because if you lose a fantasy championship with Tyreek Hill on your bench, with 30 points, how can you look yourself in the mirror that next day? I know I couldn't if I did a move like that. The point being is that you need to play your stars in fantasy football every week, but it becomes even more important to do that in the fantasy playoffs. Now, look across the league, look across the position at the quarterback position, right? Right now, Brock Purdy's a must-start. Brock Purdy has been excellent in fantasy football. Now, there's also been a lot of injuries at the quarterback position. Guys like Trevor Lawrence have gone down. Joe Burrow has gone down already. So you can't play some of those guys. Well, at the quarterback position, you need to play guys like Jalen Hurts. You need to play guys like Josh Allen. Those types of guys cannot find their way to your bench because the reality is those two guys in particular have shown an extraordinary ceiling in fantasy football. You cannot rest your stars in the fantasy football playoffs because do not be the one who has a fantasy football all-star on your bench in the fantasy championship and loses out the championship game because their star has 30 points on their bench and the guy you think had the better matchup comes up with about 10 fantasy points. So let me know what questions you need answered for your fantasy football playoffs in the comments below. And if you want to see the top 12 defense rankings for your fantasy football playoffs, click on this video right here.